Okay, so you're here to study the history of English. So let's have a brief look at some of the stages of the language that we can talk about. Usually, when we talk about the history of the English language, we divide it up into 4 periods, and that's what we're going to do on this course as well. So the modern English period is everything after 1700. That is the language stage that you're familiar with today and its most recent antecedents. So the language of people like Charles Dickens, Jane Austen also fits into this category. When you look at the early modern English period, that is the language of people like Shakespeare, with who you will all be undoubtedly familiar as well. The Middle English period is before that, 1150 to 1500. The Middle English period, if you've heard of anyone writing in this period, it's probably Chaucer. And the Old English period is what happens when you go even further back than that. So let's have a quick look through. Let's dive back in time and look what this language stage looks like, sounds like, feels like. So here you can see on the slide a passage from modern English. This is from a version of the Bible called the New International Version. I'm picking the Bible here not because I personally have any religious commitments, but because we have loads of Bibles from different stages in history, so it's useful to be able to compare. So we've got a section of the Bible here, Matthew 13, verses 3 and 4. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Now, with the exception of the verb to sow, S-O-W, which is not super common in modern English in general, you probably have no difficulty in understanding what this passage is saying. Or at least, if you do have any difficulty in understanding what this passage is saying, then you should go back to school, and you should come back in a couple of years' time when you've figured out what modern English sounds like. This shouldn't present a challenge to any of you. And if you look at the next version, this shouldn't pose too much of a challenge either. Here we've got the early modern English. This actually is from a very famous Bible, the King James Bible from 1611. And here what we can see is that this language stage looks very much like what we see today. So there are a few words, and I've underlined them, where there's a big difference from the modern language. So first of all, the passage starts with behold, which is not something that modern English speakers say all that regularly, though maybe we should reintroduce it as a new trend, starting every sentence with behold. But it would get boring very quickly if I did this, even for one lecture, so I'm not going to. Here we've got a few differences. Went forth has a little bit of an archaic flavor in modern terms. We don't hear about the birds eating. Here we hear about the fowls devouring. Fowl is an old word related to German Vogel. It's something that goes all the way back, and we'll see it again when we skip further back in time. Here we've got the Middle English version. Here, we're going back only another 200 years. But if you didn't already know what this passage said, you might suddenly start to find this a bit challenging, because there are words in there that look really quite weird. Right? We've got, first of all, it starts with lo. So again, this is old. That part is obvious and not surprising. There's other stuff here as well. So we've got words like jeder. What's going on with this word jeder, meaning went out? We also have endings that you wouldn't expect to see in the modern language. So the sower here is described as he that soweth, with an eth ending. This is a morphological third-person ending. And then on the infinitive, to sow, we have an extra e. And on the form felden, meaning fell, we've got a whole den. So where does this den come from? What does it do? This is the kind of question we can't hope to get to today, but during the course of the course, we will come back to those questions. And finally, at the end of the sentence, you've got birds of the air came and ate hem. Not them, hem. And this is something that you find in earlier Middle English texts and in Old English texts for the third person pronoun. The third person plural pronoun is not them, it's hem. So the further we go back, the more different this language is starting to look. And that, again, shouldn't be surprising. I think you might say, if you got this completely out of the blue, you might struggle with some of the words, some of the forms here, to figure out what was going on, unless you already knew what it said. But at the same time, there's a lot that's familiar here in this Middle English passage. We've got he, that, and, while. A lot of words that really look very familiar. When we go back another few hundred years, this changes drastically. So here we've got the oldest version of the Bible in the English language. This is the West Saxon Gospels from the previous millennium, from round about 990 AD. And here we've got the same text, but it looks quite radically different, and it sounds quite radically different as well. So if I were to pronounce this, and I'm not a native speaker of Old English, unfortunately, but if I were to give it a go, it sounds something like Soth litje ut eode sesadere, husad to sawen, on tha heseoth, summa hi feolon with way, on fuglas comun, on atonthar. This is English, believe it or not. It's just not exactly the English that you're familiar with. And that is why we are here in this course. Not just Old English. We will be dealing with the whole swathe of the English language, and what we're going to do this year is to drop you in at the very deep end with Old English and work forward to the modern language. So it will get easier as it goes along. Remember to keep that in the back of your mind. So don't get too depressed at the beginning of the semester, because you are dealing with the very hardest texts right at the start. And we have a lovely team of tutors who I will introduce in a second, who will be able to help you with that and to console you when your spirits are low. So, practical information. What's going to go on in this course? Well, first of all, the course aims. What we're going to do here is present the entire history of the English language from the start to the end. And that involves starting out way, way earlier than the attested texts that you can see. So this text that I've shown you from 990, we're going to go a lot further back than that. We're going to go further back to the ancestors of English itself. We're going to talk about the ancestors in Germanic terms and in Indo-European terms, because, as we will get to next week, English is a Germanic language. It belongs to the Germanic family, and the Germanic family itself, in turn, belongs to Indo-European, which is a larger family which includes many of the languages of the world, not just today's Europe, interestingly. We're going to be talking about all kinds of changes that have affected English over its history. So changes that have happened purely internally on the one hand, and changes that are due to language contact on the other hand. As we will see, English has been in contact with an awful lot of languages through its history, and English sucks up features of other languages like a sponge. And that is something that we will be covering with relation to every period of the language. We will be going through them in sequence, so we're going to start off next time with the ancestors of the language. We will progress through Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, and finally up to the present day. And we will be doing all of that in the space of 10 or 11 lectures. So that's quite a lot of ground to cover. And as of necessity, I'm only going to be able to present a rather partial picture, a limited picture of some of the most important facts and some of the most important open questions in the history of English. Because just like most other fields of research, or indeed all other fields of research, this is not a closed book. The history of English has not been finally written yet. For one thing, English is still alive. So what's happening to it now, when we speak English, when we open our mouths, when we write it, we're all making the history of the language ourselves. For another thing, the historical stages of the language aren't all that well understood. Some things are extremely well understood and have been studied for hundreds of years. Other things are barely understood at all. So this is an active research field, and I want to give you that impression. I don't want to leave you with the view that we know everything that there is to know about the history of language, the history of English in particular. We're still finding these things out. And some of my research and the research of others is about precisely these questions. If you want to later on pursue any of this further, there are other seminars that you can take later on as part of SHE 3 or other courses that you might choose to take in the history of the language. But before you decide to do that, I guess I first have to convince you that the history of the language is worth studying in the first place, so bear with me. We will also be looking at texts, and that is what you will be doing largely in the tutorials. You'll be actually digging into concrete examples of the history of the language and using them to discuss the linguistic features that you find. So here's the textbook that you will need. This textbook is Ellie van Gelderen's History of the English Language, of which I have a copy here. It is yellow and orange and grey around the edges, and you should be able to find it in the campus library. If you can, you should get your hands on the revised edition and not the 2006 original edition, but ultimately it doesn't matter all that much. So if you want to get a second-hand copy of the 2006 edition, it won't make that much of a difference. Like I say, if you can, get the new one. If you can't, oh well. There's also a companion website that you can use if you want extra online resources to support you. And of course, there'll be plenty of stuff on Ilias. A small chunk of this textbook will be available on Ilias to get you started in case you want to do the reading already and you don't yet have a copy of the book. But the whole thing will not be made available on Ilias for obvious copyright reasons. I should not be a bad person and encourage you all to download free PDFs or anything like that. That would be deeply irresponsible of me. So, what am I going to expect from you? What do I expect that you already know? Well, I expect that you've all done SHE 1, and if you haven't, then you need to talk to me and figure out what it is that you will need to bring from that class. So what I'm going to assume is that, first of all, you know the basics of English phonetics. So when I present things in the International Phonetic Alphabet, you will have some clue, you'll at least be able to decode what I'm talking about. That's important because the spelling of the English language has changed massively over the years, and the way that spellings correspond to sounds does not stay even in the remotest bit constant. So we will need an independent reference for what these sounds sound like, and that's what the International Phonetic Alphabet is for. I will also be assuming that you know about some basic things about morphology. Hopefully you will all know what the difference between inflectional and derivational morphology is. Nodding? Yeah? Okay. Good. If you don't, go and check it. And syntax, I'm going to assume that you know what basic grammatical relations are, like subject and object. But I'm not really going to be assuming much more than that. And anything that you need during the course, if you don't understand the terminology, there are linguistic dictionaries that you can go and look things up in. You can ask your tutors, or you can just Google it, and usually you will find a semi-sensible explanation for any given linguistic term. Chapter 2 of the textbook, in case you need any extra support with these linguistic terms, Chapter 2 of the textbook does have refreshers on some of this material, but you shouldn't rely on it for everything that you need to know. Okay, I am George Walkden. You can call me George. My website is on there in case you want to stalk me on the internet. There is an office in which I am regularly to be found. This is G116. I also have 2 regular office hours, Sprechstunden. These are 3:15 to 4:15 and 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. On Monday and Tuesday, respectively. And for those office hours, that's an open office hour, so you can just show up. You don't have to make an appointment in advance or sign on a list or anything like that. You're always welcome to come. You're also welcome to send me an email. But I would ask that if you do that, you ask me sensible questions and not stupid questions, because I'm not very patient with stupid questions by email. If you want to ask me a stupid question, come to my office, right? And then I will smile and nod, right? But by email, I might grumble a bit. I'm a little bit like that. Anyway. Anything else you need to know? Yeah, also I can speak German, I can read German, I can understand German, so if you want to talk to me in German or address me in German, go ahead, but it's better for your practice if you talk to me in English. Plus I'm lazy, so I prefer to speak English. I'm from England myself, by the way, in case you hadn't already figured that part out from the accent. Okay, so that's me. The other people involved in this course are our wonderful tutors. I'll ask them to stand up here and not be cameraed, but this is the four at the front here, the only people brave enough to approach within 2 rows of where I am standing. We've got Christoph on this end, we have Jens at the other end, and we have Vera and Veronica in the middle, and I can't remember which of you is which right now, which is really embarrassing. I'm sorry, you're Vera, right? Yes. Okay. And they're all there to support you. The tutorial times are given on the slides here. You've got a Tuesday morning slot for those of you who like the early start. You've got 2 late slots for those of you who like to sleep in a bit longer, and you've got a Thursday at 10 in the morning slot for normal people. But I would encourage you to spread yourselves evenly over the 4 slots, because that way you will get the most attention from your tutors individually, and ultimately you're here to learn things, or at least that will help you pass the course, even if you're not here to learn things. All right, so the lectures, you've figured that part out already. Mondays 1:30 and our 712. The slides, I'm going to make them available every week before the lecture, 24 hours before the lecture, so that if you want, you can print them out and bring them before coming to class, or you can bring the PDF and read along with the slides. That will be available for you. The other thing, as we've heard, is that the lectures will be recorded. They'll be available online. This is the link, but you don't actually need to write it down, because it will also be on Ilias, and you can link to it from there. Roland and his team have done a fabulous job in the last few years of keeping these things recorded. You may think that it's annoying having a camera in the room now, but when it comes to your state exam in a few years' time, you'll probably be quite grateful that you can revise this stuff in a way that doesn't involve leafing through a textbook. Okay, the other thing that you probably want to know about is the exam. And there isn't really much to say about the exam other than that there is one, and it takes place in the final week of the course, which is Monday the 15th of July, if I've got my calculations correct, in this room as usual. And more details of that will be released to you nearer the time. The syllabus of the course looks like this. So there won't be a class next week because it's Easter Monday. The week after that, we will be dealing with the precursors of English. After that, we'll be spending 2 weeks on Old English before gradually transitioning to Middle English. Week 7, again, we will not be having a lecture because week 7 is what is officially called Consolidation Week, I believe. They changed the name recently. You should be doing more things than just reading, apparently. You should definitely not be sitting at home and relaxing or anything like that. But the possibility is available. On the 8th, you've got the 8th session, you've got Middle English, then we've got a Pfingst Monday, then we've got the Middle English second installment. After that, we move on to Early Modern English, oops, sorry, Modern English, and then we will get to an overview and revision session before the final exam on the 14th. Now, number 3 and number 8 are marked as video lectures. This is something I'm going to be trialing this year, partly because I'm not going to be here on those days. So rather than having a lecture in this hall, I'm going to be pre-recording bits of the lecture and making them available for you to watch online. And that is what you will need to do in those 2 weeks instead of attending the lecture. You will still need to attend tutorials and things as normal. So there's going to be two of those, which are the ones marked with asterisks before Old English and Middle English 1 are both going to be in this video lecture format. And that will be available via Ilyas for you to watch. If you do ask questions, by the way, what I will do is I will repeat them so that we have a record of them for the video, because I'm the one with the microphone. But you are more than welcome to ask questions at any point, and that is quite important because if you don't know things or if I haven't made them clear, then you have every right to find out. And I'm happy, in general, if you just stick your hand up at any point, and I'll try and clarify any points that have remained unclear. If we don't have any questions for the moment, then we'll move on. Today we're just going to cover some background material. So I'm going to talk now for a while about where the English language came from, its origins. I'm going to talk also a bit about why study the history of the English language. There is one very obvious reason for you to all study the history of the English language, or most of you at least, and that is because you have to, right? Because it's in the Prüfungsordnung, and the Prüfungsordnung is God, and you have to take it very seriously indeed. However, I will endeavour to make this not as much of a punishment as it could in principle be. So hopefully you will... I'm struggling to think of another way of putting it other than I hope that you will give a shit at the end. I hope that you will give a shit about the history of the English language. And I will try and give you some reasons to give a shit later on in this lecture. At the end of the lecture, then, I'm just going to talk about some of the key themes because some issues are going to come up again and again and again throughout the course of this course. And I keep saying that. Right. So, Britain, ancient history. Well, when you look at the place where English was originally spoken, and this course is going to be fairly Anglo-centric, I'm afraid, we will take a few detours towards the end to other areas of the world, but the fact is that English was mostly spoken in the British Isles for most of its history up until about 1600, and that's what we're going to focus on mostly. And in those isles, there have been people for an awful long time. So archaeological excavations have shown that there were hominids, so early relations of Homo sapiens in the British Isles a long, long time ago, possibly 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. And here you can see on the slide, this is a tibia, a leg bone, if I remember my anatomy correctly. Yeah, Jens is nodding, he's a biologist, that's good. We have, that indicates that there were people here, and this was before the mini ice age in the history of humanity, or the actual ice age. These guys, though, the people whose bones are displayed on the slide, probably didn't have any kind of language. They were like us, but they were also, in some respects, more like the other members of the great apes in that they could not talk. So these guys are not really very interesting for linguistic purposes, and they don't tell us anything much about the history of English. During the Ice Age itself, Britain was not inhabited, but about 10,000 years ago, humans started to reoccupy the British Isles. And then we can see remnants of very, very early human activity from that period too. So one of them is Stonehenge, which you can see here. It's a load of rocks that they put on top of each other. I don't think it's all that impressive, even though it happened 5,000 years ago, but I guess they didn't have computers and stuff back then, so they had to make do with what they could use. So you've got all of this stuff that illustrates that the history of the British Isles has been one of relatively robust inhabitants, human habitation. And that may be, it shouldn't be too surprising, even though the British Isles are not the most hospitable place, and they certainly have a lot less nice climate than here. One of the reasons, incidentally, that I am here and not in the British Isles. When it gets interesting for us, it's about 3,000 years ago, because Before that, we don't really know anything about the languages of the people of the region. But from 3,000 years ago, or thereabouts, we know that the Celts came to Britain. And the Celtic tribes, or at least some of them, migrated from Europe to England and to Britain more generally. In fact, all of the British Isles and Ireland too were settled by these Celts. And in fact, the name of the place, Britain itself, and the adjective British that goes with it, actually comes from these Celtic people. It doesn't come from English itself, the Germanic language. It comes from the name of one of these Celtic-speaking tribes. So at this point, 3,000 years ago, it's important to know there were no speakers of anything like English in the British Isles. There were no speakers of any Germanic languages. There were only these Celts. And the Celtic languages survive up until the present day in some parts of the British Isles. So in Wales, in Scotland, and in Ireland, there are Celtic languages still spoken today, in varying degrees. So for instance, when we take Welsh, the language of Wales, you find quite a lot of it spoken in North Wales and substantially less in the south of Wales, though there are people who speak it all over the place. In Ireland, there are still people who speak Irish, and again, it's geographically determined who speaks it the most. And in Scotland, there are speakers of Scots Gaelic. Again, mostly in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, so in the far north of Scotland, not in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow or in the lowlands so much, though again, there are some. The Celts are important because the Celtic language influenced the English language, and we don't actually know exactly how much, but probably to a greater extent, at least, than was thought 100 years ago. So in recent years, there's been a lot of research that's brought out the role of the Celts and that has encouraged people to think of the early history of English in terms of its contacts with Celtic languages. And we're going to touch on that a bit more as we go on through the course. Okay, so the Celts were really the first people who came to the British Isles who we really need to care about for the purposes of this course. More recently, we have another group who've had an important impact, and that is the Roman Empire. So Britain was a part of the Roman Empire at its height. For a while, when the Roman Empire, like I say, was at its largest, most, if not all, of Europe and bits of what's now Africa and Asia were all under the control of this Roman Empire, and that meant, from a linguistic perspective, that the Celts, who were already in Britain, came into contact with the languages that the Romans were speaking. And those languages would have been, well, various, but the main one would have been some variety of Latin. It's important not to think of this in terms of the classical Latin that you read in textbooks. It would have been something different, even in that period. Something that is usually called vulgar Latin, not because there's anything vulgar about it, but because it was the language of the people, the common language of that time. And in fact, the northernmost limit of Roman rule during this period was in the British Isles, specifically Hadrian's Wall. This is a wall that was built to keep out the, well, to put it anachronistically, to keep out the Scottish. At the time, it kept out the Picts. It's interesting to know that while England and Wales were part of the Roman Empire, Scotland never was. So Scotland was always independent. So we've got already 3 languages, or 2 families of languages that have been influential in the history of English. That the ground is being set for the arrival of the people who actually spoke English. But that hasn't happened yet. Right? We've got Celts and we've got Romans, but we don't have anyone who is meaningfully the ancestor of, who's speaking the language that is the ancestor of present-day English, yet. That, I think, is on the next slide. Yes, here we go. Okay. So what happens next? Well, in 449 AD, this is the date that you traditionally see in textbooks, including this one here, there is an event. And the event is, there's quite a lot going on during this time. Let me see. I don't think lowering the lights will do any good because most of the light's coming in through the windows. So what's going on in this time? There are various different Celtic-speaking peoples. These Celtic-speaking peoples are basically, to some extent, fighting among themselves. This is after the time of the Roman Empire. So during this period, the Roman Empire rises, the Roman Empire falls, and some of the contact between the British Isles and the continent is, to some extent, disrupted. And as a consequence of this disruption, the peoples who were living in this area are struggling for resources, and to some extent, they are fighting among themselves. One of those people, and this here I'm following a story by a much, much later writer, Bede, the Venerable Bede, one of the earliest historians of Britain. He himself was writing in the Anglo-Saxon period, though later. He describes this in terms of a Celtic king, Vortigern, who is struggling to retain his kingdom, struggling to retain the structure of his polity against the Picts. And the Picts and the Irish are the other two groups of Celts coming from the north and from the west. The Celtic king promises to pay some Saxons from the mainland quite a lot of money in order to help them against the Picts. This deal somehow goes bad, and once the Saxons get to Britain, they don't end up leaving. That's the traditional story for the origin of the Germanic tribes and the origin of the English language in Britain. So when people ask you how old is English, when did the English language begin, the usual date that people will give is 449. Of course, it was far more complicated than that. It's not as if suddenly a ton of people came over in one particular year and before that there was no one. This is just a convenient date picked out of Bede's history that is usually used to denote the beginning of a period. But actually, when we look at Bede's story, we can see that it has quite a lot of, if not holes, then unverifiable statements. And it's important to approach, now as millennials, you are well trained in figuring out what fake news is. And you will need to apply those fake news skills to texts like Bede's, because Bede was writing with a very specific audience in mind and with a very specific political purpose in mind. And he's also not himself all that well informed as to what was going on. So he says, for instance, that there were, in particular, 3 tribes who came to England, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Now, there isn't really any evidence for these particular groupings, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, as tribes, as peoples, or as political entities, either on the continent or in the British Isles themselves. In fact, it's likely that what Bede is doing here is trying to sort of project backwards the political power of his own time. So one thing we know about Bede's age is that in Kent there was or that there had at least been a Kentish kingdom, there was a West Saxon kingdom, and there were Anglian kingdoms in the north. And it's quite possible that Bede just was thinking along straight lines and thinking, well, each of these kingdoms must date back to a single tribe. In fact, he was probably thinking more carefully than that, because one of the things that Bede wanted to do was to legitimize the political power of the time. And one of the ways he does that is to say, well, these tribes, these kingdoms, they go back a really long way. There's a great tradition of of suggesting that these people actually that the kings of these kingdoms descend from really crazy selections of people. So it's quite often the case that you will see old genealogies of the Germanic kings that try and link them back to people like Odin and Thor and the Germanic gods, just because basically a king just seems that bit more awesome if he is in fact descended from Thor, right? And it doesn't matter if it's all nonsense. The point is, stupid people will believe it. Remember, fake news. So, this story, and this whole story, there's another part of this story that stinks as well. What were the Celts called? The Saxons, what were they called? The Saxons who were invited to Britain. They were called Hengist and Horsa. Now, these names might already strike you as a little bit weird. So, Hengist, what's this? Hengist sounds a bit like German Hengst, right? And that's exactly what it is, right? And Horsa sounds a bit like English horse. And that's exactly what it is. So essentially, we've got these two brothers. They're supposed to be brothers, these two leaders as well, Hengist and Horsa, who are both basically called Horse and Horse. And so these horse brothers come to England and introduce the English language. This is not only suspicious because they're both called horse, and that's strange. I mean, maybe, people are called strange things, but what's really suspicious about this is that this particular kind of myth, this particular kind of founding myth, the idea that there were two brothers who had some sort of horse-related connection, you actually find it all over the Indo-European speaking world. You find it in other contexts too. So it's likely this is just a piece of mythology that Bede has picked up on, and he's tried to use it for his own purposes to pick out these named individuals who were in charge of bringing the Saxons to England. Bede himself, remember, was one of these people. He was an Anglo-Saxon by identity, and he was trying to legitimize these kingdoms to which he himself felt like he belonged. So one might want to be suspicious of this story. The fact is we don't really know all that much about what happened, and that's because people weren't writing about it. There's no written tradition from this time. And the only people who were writing about it were people like Bede, who were writing much, much later, 300-400 years later, for the most part. If you're interested in this kind of issue, I do teach a course most years in SHE 3 about language contact, the Celts, the Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxons, in case anyone's interested in that. Because we're not going to get to go into all of the fun detail that I would like to in the course of this particular module. All right, so that's where English came from. There must be a grain of truth to this story. Somewhere in the 5th century or thereabouts, people who spoke a Germanic language moved to the British Isles, moved to England in particular. And where did they come from? That's quite an important point too. Unfortunately, this slide is really super unclear, but you ought to be able to see it on Ilias afterwards. They came from basically northern Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium, and to a certain extent Denmark. That's where these Germanic-speaking people came from. So when we periodize the history of the language, when we divide up the language into periods, we're basing this on a couple of different things. We can either use linguistic evidence, so the linguistic features of the language, or we can use historical evidence, so things that happened external to the language at around about the right time. And in practice, we do a little bit of both. So when we define Old English, we usually define it in terms of 450 to 1150. Why 450? Well, you can already see 449 is the date that we've got from Bede, the date that says this is when Hengist and Horsa came to the British Isles. Okay, why not 449 and instead take 450? Well, that's because people who do history like round numbers. So they basically just round up to 450, and you can see all of these dates end in either a 00 or a 50. So let's pick nice round dates. As you can see, these periods are going to be more or less meaningless in actual fact. It's not the case that on New Year's Day, 1150, everyone suddenly woke up speaking a completely different language. You know that already. So these periods are, to a certain extent, fictions, but they're useful in that we can divide up our attention in certain ways. Plus, we do find the language seeming to change faster at some times than at other times, and that's something we can also try and take account of. So Old English is 450 to 1150. Sometimes you also see 1100 in the literature. Middle English is then 1150 to 1500. And we pick that date because around about 1150, 1150, we start to see more modern texts appearing, texts that look radically unlike Old English. We'll get to that, but not for a few weeks. But the Peterborough Chronicle, for instance, which is a text that we will look at later on, is one of those texts. As for the early modern English period, that is 1500 to 1700. Quite a lot of things are happening at around 1500 that make this a useful cut-off date. For the first thing, there is a linguistic sound change called the Great Vowel Shift, which I'm going to tell you more about in a minute. For the second thing, this is when printing comes in. At the very end of the 15th century, we find Caxton introducing his printing press into the British Isles. Again, I'll come back to that. The other thing that happens at around about this time is that Columbus discovers America. And I use discovers in scare quotes because, of course, there were a lot of people who were already there, a lot of whom ended up getting killed or driven out or treated in a really unpleasant way by the settlers who came to the so-called New World. But all of this was going on around 1500, which makes that a useful cut-off point. And then the next cut-off point is 1700 for the modern English period. There are again a few useful dates around here that we can use as a kind of benchmark. So the British monarchy is restored in 1660. You might remember from history class that the British monarchy had a kind of break in the middle of the 17th century. There was a period where there was no monarch, and then they brought the monarch back in 1660. We also find that in 1776, the US declares independence, and that marks what we might call the beginning of American English as a separate linguistic form, purely on political grounds. Because one of the things that you learn pretty quickly when you study the history of languages is that when you start to divide things up into neat little boxes, like modern English versus Middle English, or like American English versus British English, you quickly run into problems. You quickly find that the edges are a lot fuzzier than it seems. And especially in these early days, when there was a lot of contact between the colonies in the New World and the British Isles and England, it's very hard to draw clear boundaries between these two linguistic varieties. This is the Why Study the English Language part of the lecture, aka reasons to give a shit about the history of English. So, the main answer is, when you look at English, and I assume that since a lot of you want to become teachers of English, or you're studying English in some other capacity, you're here because you're at least vaguely interested in the English language, and that means when you look at the English language, you start to see things that don't really make all that much sense. Right? You start to see words that are spelt in weird ways. You start to see sentence structures where you think, why is it like that? And as soon as you start to get interested in that kind of question, that's where linguistics comes in. Some questions receive a very good answer from a purely synchronic perspective. Synchronic in the sense of what's going on right now? What's the structure of the system of the language? And that's the kind of thing that She 1 is all about addressing, and many of the other courses that you take will be all about addressing. There are other questions, however, that really only make sense if you look at them from a historical perspective, if you look at where the language came from and how it arose. And that's what this course is for. So if you take the English word fish, which is pronounced with a f, Hopefully you can remember what kind of sound this is. It's produced with the lips and the teeth. F, f, f. So it is a labiodental sound, and it is a fricative because it's got continuous airflow. I, you've got a vowel, and then you've got a sh at the end, which is another fricative. So if you take this word and you think about how it's spelt, well, it seems to make at least a reasonable amount of sense. If we tried to transcribe it in the International Phonetic Alphabet, it would look something like this. Note I'm using angle brackets, slashes. This means phonemic representation, right? Hopefully you all got that far in She 1. All right, so those are the sounds. Now, if you think about the way those three sounds are represented in English, they could equally well be represented in spelling by a GH, an O, and then a TI. Why? Because there are other words in which that combination of sounds is used. So, for instance, in the word enough, as given on the slide, in the word enough, the GH is pronounced f. So we can put a GH at the beginning of the word to mark out this f. What about the I? Are there any words in which I is written as the letter O? Yes, there are. Words like women, which is pronounced with an I. So, again, this second sound, this I, can be written as an O, a letter O in principle. And as for the sh, in a word like nation, the T and the I stand for the sh. So that's how you can write fish as G-H-O-T-I. Now, in this case, it's the word fish that is the sensible word. And it is the word that is spelt G-H-O-T-I that looks stupid. But there are plenty of English words where you think, why on earth is it spelt like this? Similarly, so what I've been doing throughout this lecture for some reason, I think it's chalk dust, I've been coughing, and this is written with an O-U-G-H. So that's a cough, which is pronounced off. In the word for in the word that we just talked about, enough, it's pronounced differently. This sequence of letters is pronounced uff. So we've got off, we've got uff. In the word for hiccup, which is sometimes spelt like this is pronounced up. So this can be pronounced, this same sequence of sounds can be pronounced uff, off, up. It can also be pronounced o, as in words like though, and it can be pronounced as ow, as in words like bough, the boughs of a tree. So basically, the takeaway message from here is just that English spelling is screwed up. And English spelling is screwed up. One could just say, well, fine. I'm going to learn why English spelling, I'm going to learn how exactly the ways in which English spelling is screwed up. But you might also be curious about why it's like that. Why there isn't a nice mapping between letters and sounds like there is in other languages. For instance, if any of you have tried to learn Spanish, it's beautiful. All of the letters, I mean, not all of them, but most of them map nicely onto sounds. You know when you look at a word how it's going to be pronounced. English isn't like that. Why not? Well, the short answer has to do with something called standardization. Basically, what happened is that at a certain point in time, English spelling got fixed the way it was, and then a load of other stuff happened to change the sounds of the language, sound changes, and those sound changes meant that the spelling and the sounds were not in the nice, beautiful relationship that they had been in before. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as that, but that's the basic story. So linguists often distinguish between different varieties, and when I talk about a standard variety, hopefully you will all know roughly what I mean. The standard language is a variety that is usually associated with one social or regional group, So if you take German as an example, you might think, what place do you associate the standard language with? Probably have different ideas about that, but one thing that's for sure, none of you are going to associate it with here, right? The standard language is something that's usually associated with big, important cities, and it's usually associated with big, important people, right? So that's the social element. The standard language is the variety of language that is taught in schools, so it's the variety that you, as teachers, will be responsible for transmitting. It's the variety that's usually spoken by journalists, politicians, etc. These are the big, important people. Also professors, because we're really, really big and important. And it's not a coincidence that lots of people who are in the nice, comfortable position of being a professor also speak with a posh standard accent. It's a formal variety, so it's a variety that people will use in a context like writing an essay, giving a lecture, writing a report for the newspaper, something like that. They're much less likely to use it when they're going down to the shops and meeting a friend on the way to buy a cigarette or something like that. So there are different registers. The standard variety is the formal one, and the standard variety is the one for which there are grammars and dictionaries. So when I talk about standards, that's what I mean. The boxes here give a little bit more detail on these terms that I'm using here. The standard is something that we're going to come back to. What's interesting about the standard is that it's something that developed in the course of the history of English relatively late. So there wasn't really a proper standard English, or even the notion of a proper standard English in the way that there is today until about the 17th century. So during the Old and Middle English periods, this notion was something that no one would really understood. And yet it's something that everyone takes for granted today. Everyone takes for granted that there is proper English and that there is other varieties, improper English. Everyone takes for granted that there is proper German and that there is other German, dirty German, nasty German, right? The stuff that you speak in the school playground German, that kind of thing. Right. And that's the sort of, and this is the case for a lot of languages, but it's not something that's inherent to the nature of language. And one thing that it's important to realize, I feel like I repeat this all too often, but it also needs repeating. The standard language is not better. In English, in German, in any other way, the standard language is simply a variety that, through historical coincidence, through historical accident, has become the language, the variety with the position of power. But it's not that you can say more things in the standard language. It's not that you can express more ideas. It's not that it's clearer or easier to understand inherently. It just happens to be the variety that has the prestige, that has the power. And when you look at things like that, it's quite an eye-opener, I think. And it's the way that linguists look at the language. So when you're doing linguistics, English linguistics, it's important to switch into this frame of mind. We are being descriptive linguists, not prescriptive. We're trying to understand how the language works. We are not trying to get people to use the language in a certain way. We're not trying to promote the standard language or even any other form of language. That's not our job as linguists. We are descriptivists. Now, your job, those of you who will become teachers, will be, to a certain extent, as a prescriptivist. Your job will be to get some sort of formal, official, proper form of English across to the students who you will be teaching. And it's up to you how you do that, of course, but what's important, I think, to bear in mind is, like I say, the variety of English that is the standard is not the standard because it is inherently better than other varieties. It's simply the standard because of the way that the history of the language has emerged. It's an accident, essentially. And so what you're teaching is the skills for people who want to be able to speak that variety. And this idea of standardization is something that that we're going to come back to. Today I'm just going to talk about it as it relates to spelling. So when we look at how the Old and Middle English scribes used the language, if you can remember back as far as the start of this lecture, nearly an hour ago, and I know it's hard when you have a limited attention span, but hopefully you still remember what happened an hour ago. We've got the Roman alphabet. Everything we see in the history of English is written in the Roman alphabet. And that is more or less true for every stage of the language. There was a brief period where things were a little bit different earlier on. We'll get to that in due course. But for the most part, English was written using the Latin alphabet. And we see that there was a lot of variation. So the word that is now written psalm was in Old English could be written in various different ways, with a P, with an E, with an A, all kinds of different combinations that you see on the slides there. But because there wasn't a standard, and there wasn't any reason for there to be a standard, on the whole, these Old and Middle English scribes were not all that fussy about how they wrote the language. At the end of the Middle English, something different starts to happen. A chancery, and that is an organization, it is a place which is responsible for producing official documents. They start shifting from using Latin for their official documents to using English. And when they do that, they use a particular variety of English. And because they're very important, because they're very prestigious, that influences other people's usage as well. Now, this is not to say that the people who wrote the Chancery documents were all that consistent either. They used a lot of different rules, a lot of different ideas about the language. So the GH at the end of the word high was always written even though it's silent. This is when the standardization process starts, at the end of the Middle English process. We start to get a written standard, a standard for written documents that doesn't necessarily represent how people would speak. In the emergence of the printing press, as I mentioned, also has an influence on this. So Caxton starts off the printing press. The printing press allows documents to be reproduced and spread across the whole area, which obviously spreads one particular variety of English to a lot of people. This, again, encourages the process of standardization. Later on, we get English dictionaries being produced, we get the King James Bible being produced, and these are developments, again, that push towards a greater standardization of the language. We're going to come back to standardization when we get to early modern English, because that's when this really kicks off. What about the Great Vowel Shift then? Well, the crucial thing is that the standard was starting to develop in the 15th century with the chanceries, but the Great Vowel Shift did not run to completion until substantially later. The Great Vowel Shift, what is it? Well, it's one of the most famous changes in the history of the English language. Basically, you can think of it as putting all of your vowels in a washing machine and then switching it on. And they go round and round and round. And that's what we see in this diagram. So what we see is that the vowels that are on the outside, specifically the vowels that are at the bottom of the vowel quadrilateral, they go upwards, and the vowels that are at the top of the vowel quadrilateral go inwards and become what's called diphthongized. So E, which is a single vowel with a single quality, becomes I, which is a vowel which has two elements to it. So if you produce this sound slowly, I, you'll tell that it's two sounds, right? I, right? It's an A and an E mushed together. So That's the great vowel shift. And that, basically, this vowel shift is why the spelling of English, one of the main reasons why the spelling of English is so messed up. Because the English vowel shift, first of all, the vowels correspond relatively closely to where they are in modern day, in languages like modern day German, and then everything gets mixed up. So in Middle English, a word like boot, so the boot as in something that goes on your foot, would have been pronounced in the Middle English period something like boot, like modern German boat, boot, which is where modern English boat is now, roughly, but not quite the same. So as you can see, this vowel shift messed up the mapping between vowels and their spellings, and that is one important factor. And if you know about the great vowel shift and how it affects the long vowels in the history of English, then that gives you some kind of explanation for why the spelling of modern English has such a weird mapping to the pronunciation, to the phonetics. And that is hopefully, that's something I'm not expecting you to just immediately grasp all of that. We will be coming back to the great vowel shift in the context of Middle English and early modern English. But that's just basically the outline of the story. That's the kind of thing that you can only explain in the English language if you know a little bit about its history. Finally then, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some themes that are going to recur throughout this course. So one of the themes is internal change versus external change. Another of the themes is, why is English not more like German? As mostly speakers of German, this might be of interest to you. English and German are historically very closely related, and when we start looking at Old English, what we will see is that it looks quite a lot like German in many respects, but nowadays it doesn't look much like German at all. So how did all of that happen? What happened? Did German move away from English, or did English move away from German, or was it a sort of you can think of it a bit like a divorce, right? Usually one partner is mostly responsible, but sometimes it's kind of a mutual agreement to part ways. Right? So when German and English got divorced, who was the one who was the bad one, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Another theme is the change from a synthetic language to an analytic language. If you don't know what those terms mean, don't worry. I'm going to get to that. So first of all, on the issue of English and Germanic. English is a Germanic language, and the evidence that we need to establish that is something that we're going to cover next time. But often, modern English does not look like the other Germanic languages. So if we just take the word for someone who fixes your teeth when they're broken. Right. Now, in German, this is a Zahnarzt, right? And the word Zahnarzt is a nice word because it's very, very literal. It's like, it's an Arzt who can fix your Zahn, right? That's fine, right? There's no particular problem here. And when you look at the other Germanic languages, you find roughly the same thing. Dutch, Tandarzt. So if you know what an Arzt is and you know what a Tand is, then you know that this is the guy who can fix your tooth. Similarly, in Danish, you've got a slightly different word for doctor, læge, or something like that. I don't actually speak any Danish, so I don't know what this sounds like, but that's how it's spelled. Similarly, Swedish, läkare, and this word tand for tooth. So in all of the words, in all of the Germanic languages, the word for this guy who fixes your teeth, or guy or woman or whatever, I'm not going to be gender specific about people who fix your teeth, this is a straightforward, transparent word, tooth doctor. English doesn't do this. English has the word dentist, which is really unhelpful because unless you know that the word, that the Latin word for tooth has the root dent, then you will not know what this word means unless you've looked it up in a dictionary. And there are many stupid things in English like this, where English is the only Germanic language that does something really, really weird. Here's another example of the kind of changes that we see when we compare the modern languages. So here we've got some Old English and we've got some German. And we've got some modern English as well. Now, hopefully you can see the point here. The Old English, ich habe hier geholpen, is not all that different from a German sentence like ich habe ihr geholfen. Right? These are not fundamentally that different in structure. In fact, if as native German speakers you were suddenly transported to the 9th century England, you would probably have a reasonably decent chance, better, I would imagine, than most actual speakers of English today. Simply by virtue of the fact that your language, German, is a lot closer to Old English than the English of today. And that you can see when you compare these lines. So first of all, the pronoun in modern English is completely different. You've lost this sh element, this fricative at the end. It's I, and the vowel has changed. We know what to blame for the vowel, right? That's the great vowel shift in action. In Middle English, it would have been, the pronoun would have been E, and it's changed into I. We've also got a V instead of a B in our verb to have. So Old English habe and German habe, very, very similar. Modern English have with a V. And then we've got something else weird, which is that the order of the words is different, the syntax is different. In German and in Old English, we've got the object before the verb, and in modern English, we've got the object after the verb. And then there's the form of the verb. So Old English has this ye prefix, it's a ge, and German has a ge prefix, but modern English doesn't have it. And also modern English, the vowel is different. So we've got helped. If you know anything already about the types of verb in these languages, you might be able to see that the verb to help in German and in Old English is what's called a strong verb, and in modern English it's what's called a weak verb. But we'll come back to that later if that doesn't mean anything to you. So what happened here? Why did modern English diverge so massively from the other Germanic languages? In terms of our divorce analogy, it looks like basically English was cheating on its partner, right? English was the one that was fremdgegangen. Right? So English, and we'll see in a second who exactly English was fremdgegangen with, because there were a lot of other possible suspects. So when we talk about linguistic change, we can categorize them into two different types. Internal change, so change that is motivated by internal linguistic factors, things that just have to do with speaker internal properties like ease of articulation. These are things like ease of articulation. So an and a p are easier to pronounce together than an and a k, and that's simply because if you think about it, they're produced closer together in the mouth. The and the p are both labial sounds. They're both produced with the lips, whereas the k is produced at the back of the mouth, which is why an mk is a harder sound to make than an mp. Okay? Children, in particular, are known for simplifying their language in such a way as to make it easier. And if this happens a lot, then it will lead to language change, of course, because what are children going to do? Most of the time, they're going to live longer than you, right? You die, and the children are still alive. That's a really depressing way of thinking about it, but it's also true. So treat your children nicely. They're the future of the planet. Internal change is something that we can see happen everywhere. External change is brought about by language contact, sometimes by historical need. So when we talk about historical need, we can use the word Brexit, which is simply a word that no one had any need for until about 3-4 years ago. And suddenly now we can't stop hearing it, which is really annoying. There are also words like goji berry. So unless you actually have a goji berry, you don't need the word for goji berry. Right? And so this is something that you only have the word for if you need it. Similarly, a computer. We didn't have computers until a few decades ago, so there was no word for computer either. Why would there be? And these are the kind of external changes that we can talk about. We're not talking about individuals and the sort of inherent properties of human beings. We're talking about the specific properties of individual socio-historical sets of circumstances. So we get all kinds of change, and during this period, external change, during the history of English, external change has played a fairly major role. And in particular, the kind of external change that we're talking about is influence of other languages. So if English has been cheating on its partner, these are the possible people it has been cheating with. So we've got different language families here. Along the bottom, we've got a timeline. So this is the history of the language going along the x-axis. And then we've got the graph showing the languages which at any given point English or Germanic was in contact with. Now, before English was even in the British Isles, it was already in contact with Latin, because the Germanic speakers were on the borders of the Roman Empire, and they were talking to the Romans, and they were trading with them, and they were fighting with them, and all kinds of things. So there's a very, very old set of Latin loanwords in Germanic that are shared by German and English that go back to a time when German and English were actually only one language. And so they're both West Germanic languages, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. Next week, we'll talk about that. Or the week after, because of Easter, yeah. Then when English gets to the British Isles, it comes into contact with another set of people who we've already talked about. It comes into contact with the Celts. And the Celts have certain amount of influence. You can see sample words. So for instance, the place Dover. Dover is quite an important place in Britain, though it's not very big. It's important because it's the first place you arrive if you come to the British Isles by sea from Europe, the White Cliffs of Dover. And the name of the place comes from Celtic, because they were the people who were there first. From about 800 onwards, we see Norse influence on the English language, Scandinavian influence, words like egg. From 1066 onwards, 1066 is an important date. If you don't know any other date about the history of English, you probably know this one. So I'm not going to repeat what it's all about. Go and look it up if you don't know. 1066, we suddenly start to get French influence. Specifically at this early point, a variety of French called Anglo-Norman. Later on, we get more Latin influence again. We get Greek influence. We get all kinds of influence from languages which English came into contact with during its colonial external history, such as pajamas, which I think is a Hindi loanword into English, though I might be wrong about that. The trouble with having my lectures recorded is that there is proof that I'm wrong about things sometimes, and that is awkward, but I'm right most of the time, so it's fine. And of course, up until recent years, language contact is still going on. Words are still being introduced into the English language. So, and this is always important, right? None of this is stopped. Language history is still going on. We are a part of this right now. When you look at where the words come from in English, you actually see that they come from all over the place, but in particular, they seem to come from French and Latin. So when you look at the most frequent words, if you only look at the 1,000 most frequent words, the absolute top most frequently used words in the history of the language, you find that 4/5 of them come from Old English directly. They're inherited. If, however, you look at the top 2,000, the top 3,000, or the top 10,000 words, so if you broaden it out to include more words, you suddenly find that the lexicon of the language actually has more words from French than it does from Old English. So an absolutely huge number of lexical borrowings from French. When we get to the period where we talk about the Norman conquest and the history of the Middle English, the early Middle English period, we will be talking more about how this happened, how English managed to borrow so many words from French. Now, of course, German borrowed some words from French, but never to anything like the same extent as English. And this is almost certainly due to the particular historical circumstance. The fact that at a very important time in its history, England was actually conquered by the Normans. That's the 1066 thing. So we've got a load of French loanwords. We've got English diverging from the other Germanic languages by taking on many, many words from non-Germanic languages. And not just words. We will see also examples of potential morphological influence, phonological influence, even syntactic influence later on. If you look at this petition, this is a petition that was launched on the official government website of the British Isles to remove all of the French words from the cover of the British passports. Now, British passports have the words "On y soit qui mal y pense" on the front, which is an old motto, goes way, way back. It's associated with the royal family. Someone started a petition to get these words removed from the front of the passport. What's funny about this petition is that these words, the words that are underlined, are themselves words that come from either French or some other language. So all of the words that are underlined in blue on this slide, like remove, passport, cover, control, borders, these are words that come from French directly into English. There are other words also that come into English from Latin, like voted, words like motto, which is an Italian word, words like take and there, which are typically assumed to be borrowings from Norse, from the North Germanic languages, the Scandinavian languages of the Vikings. And then there are words like British, which itself comes from the name of a Celtic people. So the idea that English as a language, or any particular text written in English, can ever be some sort of pure entity, some sort of purified Germanic text, is completely ridiculous and absurd. This language is an absolute mongrel. It's got bits from everywhere. If we think about English as having fremdgegangen, then English has been sleeping with absolutely every other language on the planet. Right? This is the village bicycle of the linguistic world. What about internal changes then? So the great vowel shift, vowels tend to be distributed fairly evenly, so there could be internal motivators here, but there are also potential external motivators. And here it's quite important to distinguish between the origin in individuals of a linguistic change and the spread of that change through the community. Because any change has to start somewhere, it has to start with someone, but it also has to spread through the community. So both of those are important, innovation and spread. And we can use, actually, one of the things that we can do, hopefully you will have the opportunity to take a sociolinguistics course at some point in your studies and explore this interface between language variation and society in more detail, if you're interested in that kind of thing. One of the things that we can do is we can study changes that are going on right now all around us, because languages never stay still, and we can use those to understand the changes that happened in the past. So, for instance, the fact that assimilation is common in consonants may, in some instances, lead to a linguistic change. So, if you say something like "in Paris," usually the nasal before the p will come out more like a m, "in Paris," rather than a n, because it's close to that other sound, which is a bilabial sound. And that bilabial feature is kind of spread to the consonants around it. So that's how certain changes can in principle arise. This one hasn't happened yet. This is a change that could happen, but hasn't happened yet. Finally, there's this topic of synthetic versus analytic, and I apologise for introducing some terminology right at the end of the lecture, but these are two terms that you may not have come across before. Basically, a synthetic language is one in which grammatical relations and semantics are marked by morphological endings, and an analytic language is one in which those same grammatical relations and semantic features are marked by word order. In other words, a synthetic language is one that makes more use of inflectional morphology, and an analytic language is one that makes more use of its syntax to express the same meanings. And English, over the history of this language, has become more analytic. We might want to ask why that is the case. That's something we're going to revisit relatively soon, because when you look at Old English, you see one of the main differences between Old English and modern English is that Old English has a load of morphology that modern English doesn't have anymore. Modern English has lost a whole load of inflectional morphology. Okay, so just to wrap up then, what we've seen is that the English language has changed quite a lot. If you compare that little text from the West Saxon Gospels that we saw near the start, that's only 1,000 years ago. And in that time, the language has become completely incomprehensible to speakers today. So one of the questions that anyone with half a brain should ask when they see something like that is why? Why is this happening? Why has this happened? And that's one of the things that we're going to try and explain. English originated, the starting point of English was this Germanic, what's traditionally called an invasion. It might have been more like a peaceful migration, but that's controversial. We've talked about the three main historical periods, Old, Middle and Early Modern English. And I've tried, I'm not sure how well I've succeeded, but I've tried to give you some reasons why you should give a shit about the history of the English language in the first place. I've also tried to illustrate some of the themes that will be coming up again and again when we study the history of English. So English versus German, or English as a Germanic language, how does this fit together? The question of internal change on the one hand versus external change on the other hand, the question of a synthetic language versus an analytic language, and how English has changed from more synthetic to more analytic. All of this is going to come back as the course goes on. What your job is now is to read chapters 1 and 2 of the textbook. And after that, you will be well prepared for what happens next, which is a video lecture on the precursors to the English language before Old English. And that's it for today.